Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Dr. Coffee is back on the line for a really interesting episode. How you doing, Dr. Steve?
Oh, it's another day above ground, living the dream, Jordan. Another day.
I love it. I got my coffee here going. I got my caffeinated coffee, which is pertinent to today's topic. You know, on this show, we're all about education. We are definitely coffee evangelists at heart. But Dr. Steve, we're looking to be objective here. We're looking to relay information and maybe most importantly, spark these doctors or whoever's listening to do more research on their own, to dig a little bit deeper. Do you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. I think since coffee is the number one antioxidant and it's the biggest change a patient can make in their diet, then I think every doctor owes it to their patients to learn what they can about coffee.
So today we want to be talking about who shouldn't be drinking coffee. We're going to talk about caffeine sensitivity. We're going to talk about acidity and all that stuff. Let's start with caffeine and caffeine sensitivity, because this is probably the big one. When I talk to people who don't drink coffee, you know, the two big ones that come up are coffee belly, and then even more than that, the jitters, right? Caffeine sensitivity. Dr. Steve, why, in your estimation, are some people so affected by caffeine? Is it about their brain receptors being more sensitive? Is it a metabolism thing? I'd imagine a higher metabolism would get it into your system faster. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll answer that for you, Jordan, just as soon as I can quote my favorite Ronald Reagan.
Hit me.
How about that? Can I quote him?
Hit me.
So Ronald Reagan said, "I never drink coffee after lunch. I find it keeps me awake for the afternoon."
I'm an afternoon napper myself, so I relate.
So that was good coming from the President of the United States. And the question about caffeine is really an interesting question, because I'm going to share with everybody today two things that people don't know about caffeine. One is that caffeine is related to our genetics, how we handle caffeine. Mm-hmm. And the other is that the caffeine is related to how our liver and adrenal works. Oh, wow. So when we get a patient that has caffeine issues, we need to be looking at both their genetics and at their adrenals and liver.
Wow. Talk to me about the effects on the adrenal and liver.
So, it's called caffeine clearance. And our ability to clear caffeine from the system is related to what the liver is like and what the adrenal glands are like. So what I mean by that is your adrenal glands are the glands that secrete adrenaline as one of the things that they secrete. Mm-hmm. And that's our fight and flight hormone. And if the adrenals get stimulated very easily, and some of this is going to be esoteric to some of your guests. Mm-hmm. I promise this is real medicine. I promise that this is not airy-fairy, even though I still like airy-fairy. But there's real understanding. And Hans Selye, the great Swiss, I think he was Swiss researcher who really coined the term stress, talked about the 3 or 4 phases to how the adrenals go. And he took rats, put them in an electric cage, and the closer they got to the food, the more the electric shock occurred. And then he would take them and cut them open and measure their adrenal glands. And he talked about the 3 phases, with the 0 phase being normal adrenals, and then the first phase where the rat is shocked somewhat, and it's new experience for the rat, so the adrenals get a little bigger. And then the second phase where they get much bigger. And then the third phase is where they actually shrink. Mm. And so what happens is that the more we try and wear out, it's almost like wearing out our pancreas and insulin sensitivity. So now everybody, and I know I'm random all over the place, but I'll tie it all
it's great.
together for your people, I promise.
No, it's
Where
fantastic.
we talk about more and more people having this metabolic syndrome and pre-diabetes, our receptors become insensitive to insulin. So what happens is that, we secrete some insulin, and then there's no place for it to cause its effects, because the place that it rests to the microphone, the megaphone that it yells through to change blood sugar, that's no longer available for it. Well, the same kind of thing happens with the adrenals, where you get, a little stimulation and your adrenals kick in some adrenaline. You get too much stimulation and eventually the adrenals don't handle it well at all. Well, if you're in that second phase 2 or 3, whichever way we're looking at it, where the adrenals are much bigger and responding more, you put a little caffeine into the body and the adrenals just go for broke. They secrete all this adrenaline. Then the second part of it is that the clearance for caffeine has to go through your liver. Any of your car aficionados out there, the liver is to the body what the oil filter, I guess, is to the car. So everything that needs to get filtered goes through the blood. It goes through the lymphatic system. It winds up in the kidneys and the liver. The kidneys do their filtering. The liver does its filtering. And if it can't clear caffeine properly, then higher levels of caffeine stay in the system. So both of those things lead to what I call sensitivity to caffeine. So on the other side, and sensitivity caffeine, which may be healthy for our heart. So there is some knowledge that we have that caffeine has a positive effect on us. And, I could list a whole slew of diseases that caffeine helps. Would you like me to do that?
I would like to explore that, and then also explore what's lost in decaffeinated coffee and what we're benefiting from the caffeinated coffee. So yes, why don't you start with the benefits of caffeine itself?
Okay, so caffeine helps with, we know it helps with Parkinson's disease. We know it helps with MS. We know it plays some help in Alzheimer's. And I think I've said in previous podcasts, so any listener that wants more in depth on this, for example, the way that the statistics that show how drinking caffeine decreases the risk of getting Alzheimer's or getting Parkinson's. It helps with attention. It helps with focus. It helps with warding off depression. So depression is left in caffeine drinkers. It helps with weight loss. We know it helps with weight loss. It helps with prevention of diabetes. And most cognitive functions are helped with caffeine. So
memory, reaction time, things like that.
Exactly. Exactly. Test taking for students. So having some caffeine before you go for a test seems
focus.
to help.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, depending upon your ability to clear caffeine and your genetics, which we haven't talked about yet, there's a sweet spot for how much is enough and how much is too much. And I can tell you that it is totally individualized, that no two people are exactly the same for how much coffee they can have. There are people that can have caffeine, at 5 o'clock and still go to bed. There are other people that can't have caffeine at all at night because after 2 o'clock it keeps them up.
Right. I mean, there are some people that just can't drink a cup of coffee because it spazzes them out. And that's what's
Exactly.
really so interesting. That's a good way to put it, individualized, but also the massive spectrum. I would relate it to alcohol. I'm extremely sensitive to alcohol, and not even so much the intoxicating properties, but that too. But the way it affects my body. And also, alcohol is like a neurotoxin, so maybe this is an unfair example. But the point is, when I see people who are able to consume these large quantities of alcohol, I think to myself, that would kill me. But this person can consume it and get up the next day and go to work. It's just really fascinating. It must be genetic markers, or at least a lot of it must be genetics, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is genetics, but and I know you weren't doing this, Jordan, but comparing coffee and alcohol are two different things.
Right.
They're not on the same plane. I always say coffee is a beverage that puts one to sleep when you don't drink it.
Right. And I know we've discussed that, talking about sleep, really, really actually fascinating, whereas alcohol kind of destroys your sleep. But I guess what I'm talking about is the ability for one human to consume this large quantity of this psychoactive and another human that barely can consume any at all, but they're the same species.
Sure, and a lot of that, again, has to do with the clearance through the liver, our ability to use our liver properly to clear. And caffeine is, as I said, something that helps a lot of these disease processes. There are things, though, that coffee helps, whether it's caffeinated or not caffeinated. So we see things like eye disease is helped by the antioxidants in coffee and not affected whether it's caffeinated or not caffeinated. Skin quality, non-caffeinated versus caffeinated, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Gallbladder health, kidney health. The fight against colorectal cancer is not influenced by caffeine. It's just influenced by coffee alone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in coffee, if you listen to some of the previous podcasts, we talked about all the chemicals that were in coffee. So you have the caffeine, which is not removed when you make decaffeinated coffee. And just as an aside, there's really only one way to drink decaf coffee, and that's Swiss water process, unless somebody comes up with some other non-toxic way of removing caffeine. But you don't want to have caffeine leached out by EDTA or any of the chemicals that are used to leach it.
Yeah, and we've covered that in past episodes, is the importance of a healthy cup of coffee. That's what we're talking about here on the show. And when we talk about these studies, that's what we're talking about. Quick question about caffeine. Does that perk you up at all? Does the prefix there have anything to do with its stimulating qualities? I mean, I know some people kind of wake up with a cup of decaf, but it obviously doesn't have close to the same effect as a caffeinated cup.
So the antioxidants in coffee and the chemicals in coffee will help wake you up, as you say, but not to the same effect that caffeine
Not
does.
a stimulant.
It's not a stimulant.
Okay.
Yeah, caffeine is an anti-inflammatory, and so it helps with reducing inflammation, which you and I have talked about as a precursor to helping all disease processes. We're looking at how do you modulate inflammation, and caffeine does a great job of doing that. The other thing caffeine does is it helps with bile acids in your gallbladder, and it modulates how much is there. So you can get a nice kick from the gallbladder, which sort of sorts the intestines to do their thing, and that kind of wakes you up as well.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we've talked about is, roasting the coffee, and trigonelline, which is a compound where you get that bitter alkaloid that's in coffee for its unique aroma. It has antibacterial properties. It supports oral health, and that is affected by the roasting process, but not by the removing of caffeine.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me like the non-caffeinated covers a lot of organs, covers a lot of, different parts of the body, whereas the caffeinated benefits seem to be very cognitive, Diabetes was on that list too, but you know what I mean? When you put Alzheimer's and dementia under benefits from caffeine, that kind of suggests that it's pretty cognitive. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I'm a believer in caffeinated coffee. I think that if you're going to drink coffee and you can tolerate caffeine, then you should drink caffeinated coffee because caffeine has lots of benefits. Some people complain about their sensitivity to caffeine, and with those people
are weak. I'm joking.
Yeah,
I'm just
that's
joking.
Right. They're weak.
No, I'm one of those people, so we'll get into that in just a second. But sorry, finish your thought there.
We'll talk about the things that people can do for modulating the effects of caffeine. And one of them is to know your genetics. So I think getting some genetic testing, if you really want to find out how to modulate the jitters and anxiety that caffeine affects you and doesn't affect your spouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's important to do on a lot of different levels. Those genetic tests can really be eye-opening. But let's dive into that now. These doctors, maybe they have a patient who's interested in these studies and they're interested. Maybe they have a family history of Parkinson's or dementia and they ask the doctor, "What can I do?" This is one thing you can do. What if their patient says, "Oh, I'm really sensitive to caffeine"? What are some tips that you have for them?
Let's talk about the genetic testing first, and
Sure.
then we'll go over the tips. So the first genetic test is CYP1A2, and it's a gene that codes for the enzyme that breaks down caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about people who are either slow metabolizers of caffeine or quick metabolizers of caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
And the gene that controls that is the CYP1A2. And you can have a variant which makes you a slow metabolizer. So you get one copy of the gene from each of your parents, from your mother and dad. And if you wind up being a slow metabolizer for caffeine, then you have to modulate it.
Mm-hmm. I would think that the high metabolism would increase intensity, but the slow metabolism is what you're saying keeps it in your system for longer.
Yeah, so when you use the word intensity, that's an interesting word because you really have to talk about the difference. And this is what I was leading up to with the adrenals and the liver versus the genetics. There's a concept called caffeine tolerance,
mm-hmm.
and there's a concept called caffeine sensitivity.
Ah, I see.
And caffeine sensitivity is really your genetic disposition for how you handle caffeine. At least that's how I code it. So if we're going to play on the same playing field, we should have our words down. When I talk about caffeine sensitivity, I'm really talking about your genetic predisposition to whether or not you're a quick or slow metabolizer of caffeine. And when you talk about caffeine tolerance, that's more of your liver clearance and your adrenals and the health of those two organs.
Mm-hmm. What about this? What about the more psychological level? Like you said, the tendency to kick in fight or flight and how that relates to anxiety. Are people who are more, likely to enter the flight mode, maybe people who are prone to anxiety because of conditioning of some kind or whatever it is, are those maybe the people who are more likely to be caffeine sensitive or rather just, have the effects of caffeine, give them the jitters and have an unpleasant experience? Let's put it that way.
Jordan, you asked the greatest questions, and I'm just honored that you call me Dr. Coffee to answer these things. So there are these receptors in the brain that are adenosine receptors. And the type of receptors and how they get stimulated in the brain has to do with your fight and flight effects, along with your adrenals secreting adrenaline. if your adrenals are not working right or your adenosine receptors are not working right, then you are not responsive to the effects of caffeine or over responsive to the effects of caffeine.
Mm.
And again, that may or may not have to do with the genetic component.
And that makes sense to me,
So there are three levels to caffeine sensitivity. There's people that are hypo or low sensitive to caffeine. There are people that are normal sensitivity to caffeine, and people that are very sensitive to caffeine.
Mm.
So very sensitive, you can have just a little bit of caffeine, even decaf. Now, people don't always know this, but caffeine exists in things other than just coffee. Chocolate has caffeine.
Right.
I'm not talking about where they add caffeine, like Mountain Dew or Coke, where they add caffeine.
Yeah,
to it.
naturally occurring in the Monster Energy drink, springs.
Yeah, I'm talking about naturally occurring. So coffee, green tea has caffeine. Other types of tea, black tea has caffeine too. There are different chemical compositions of caffeine. So the type that's in coffee is different than the type that's in
Oh, wow. I
tea.
didn't know that.
Oh, absolutely. And in the type that's in plants like guarana is a totally different chemical makeup of caffeine.
Wow. That's
But
fascinating
the
stuff.
end result is they're all considered caffeines, and they will affect people differently. I get absolutely zero caffeine effects from tea.
That could be a tolerance issue, though, could it not?
It could, but it's a different.
I don't mean to judge you on your consumption, Steve.
Well, I don't drink all that much. I mean, I'm nothing like my favorite comedian, Emo.
Oh,
What
Emo
does
Phelps,
he
he's my favorite.
Do you love him?
Yeah, totally. He's the weird guy who talks all funny, and he has those short punchline jokes.
Yeah. So, do you know his coffee joke?
Oh, please enlighten us. I don't recall.
He says, "When I wake up in the morning, I just can't get started until I've had that first piping hot pot of coffee. Oh, I've tried other enemas."
It's so genius the way that it can build. Takes you one direction and then it just builds. I think it's all about relativity. Like you said, I know some people who are into large amounts of consumption and other forms of consumption. So I guess it's all relative, right, Steve?
Yes, exactly.
But let's talk to be honest, I'm one of those people who is caffeine sensitive, and I incorporated coffee into my diet for health purposes, Steve. I don't know if you know this about me, but I didn't drink coffee until just a couple of years ago. My whole life, probably first 25 years of my life, I never drank coffee. And one of the reasons was the effect that caffeine has on my body. I can get anxiety. My heart rate goes up very easily. I can get jittery. I found a lot of that went away when I drank a high quality coffee, purity roasts for low acidity, testing for no pesticides. All that really does make a massive difference to someone like me. But let's talk about advice that you can give patients who are sensitive to this stuff. And then I will kind of add on to that my personal experience.
Sure. So realize that removing caffeine from coffee does not have any effect on removing mold.
Right.
So since a lot of the times when people are sensitive to coffee, part of it is a mold issue. And if you listen to Mark Hyman, he's the medical director of I think it's Cleveland Clinic Integrative Medicine. He's an MD out of Cleveland. Mark has a podcast called Broken Brain. And he talks about his own challenges with health and mold. And I've seen many a patient that had black mold issues where they lived in a house that had mold and it got into their brain, and
Whoa.
They got real weirded out. People that tolerate caffeine well can have, like me, 500 milligrams of caffeine. I could have 500 milligrams before bed and still be able to sleep
Right.
my normal 3 hours, There are other people that have medium levels where they're not as sensitive. They can have 200 milligrams. People like you start off with 100 milligrams and they get jittery. And for people that are sensitive, we want to do three things. We want to give them L-theanine. L-theanine is an amino acid that helps caffeine become much more tolerable, and it increases focus in the brain and gets rid of the jitteriness. So I get up every morning, I look in the obituary. If my name's not there, I say what a great day this turned out to be, and I drink my Purity coffee. But I also take my L-theanine as part of my routine.
And that's just a supplement? I'm Googling it now. It's just a supplement that you can incorporate in your diet, derived from tea leaves, it seems?
Yeah, it's derived from tea. We recommend T-Vigo, which can be found on the Level 1 Therapeutics website. But T-Vigo is a real good quality Japanese manufacturer of tea.
Nice.
And it's just a wonderful quality L-theanine, so we recommend that. And then we also want to check, make sure the liver is working correctly and make sure the adrenals are working correctly. I have a test that we do with patients in which we have them sitting and we do their blood pressure. We have them lay down, we do their blood pressure, and then we immediately have them stand up and we do their blood pressure. And if they go from sitting to laying to standing and their blood pressure drops when they stand, it's a positive sign for orthostatic hypotension. And the first thing we want to do then is look at promoting healthy adrenals.
Why don't you touch on that a little bit?
There are a number of supplements. I'm a believer in supplements. I believe that we can eat a great diet. I believe that a lot of the foods are grown in depleted soil. The Bible talks about how you're supposed to rotate crops and everything. I think there was significant wisdom that God had when he told us how to do that, because it has
Steve,
to do with...
You have no idea. I'm deep into the big ag world right now on some of my other podcasts. And if you understand the evolution of agriculture in this country, you're absolutely right. We've torched the soil in this country. And we have gone away from ancient farming practices, which were there for a reason. But the good news is I'm talking to experts and there are people working on it, and we are rejuvenating the soil in a lot of parts of the country using microbes and other things. But you're 100% right. And it does have an effect on the food that is grown in that soil. Surprise, surprise. The soil food web is super, super important. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, so I think we can make the most of our diet, but we can use supplements as a pharmaceutical grade supplement to enhance our well-being. So we may want to use something to help the liver function better. There's a great product out there for liver function called LivaFlow. There's a great product by Jigsaw that helps the adrenal glands. There's other products. I only know the ones we've researched, and we try and recommend things that we know are evidence-based because they work. But, I'm not going to go head-to-head with any other companies that say they have things unless I've really looked at them. But there are things we can do to support the adrenal, things we can do to support the liver. And if anybody ever wants to send me an email and ask me specifics, I'll be glad to answer it. But that's what we want to do, is support the adrenals and the liver, and adrenals and L-theanine.
So that's interesting coming from you because you've got some really, specific and biological advice. And now I get to give my ultra lay opinion and experience, which I guess is important to doctors as well, anecdotal evidence, experience from their patients. And I'll just tell you what I did, personally in the habits that I changed in my life, because like I said, I am the type of person to incorporate high leverage health moves. And when I learned about coffee and all the different health benefits, I incorporated them into my diet, even though I didn't really like the way it tastes. I love it now. And I was sensitive to it, but I said, hey, I'm going to give this a shot. Watching my food was a big deal for me. I am a high metabolizer. I'm a fast metabolizer, and I can tend to get anxiety if I lack healthy fats. I am a big believer in the new fat diet fads. I know there's a lot of debate over their long-term effects, and maybe I will get heart disease down the road from it. But the way my brain feels on a high-fat diet is much, much better. Clear thinking, lack of anxiety, lack of brain crash. Incorporating that in my diet also reduced my jitters, reduced my anxiety, reduced my raciness from coffee significantly. And just eating healthy foods around the time I drink coffee. Drinking coffee on an empty stomach definitely ramps up my experience, ramps up the intensity and the raciness of coffee. That's got to be pretty common among people, right, Steve?
It's very common, yes.
So a full breakfast, a healthy breakfast, and then a cup of coffee, if you're sensitive, can really go a long way. And I think that's the case with a lot of different psychoactives, right, Steve? I mean, drinking on an empty stomach is a bad idea, probably for the same reason.
Yeah, and you just use that term, which is a great term. Caffeine is considered a psychoactive drug.
Right.
And about 87% of the United States fuels up on it daily, including children.
Right. No, I mean, I'm not saying exactly. Psychoactive kind of has a negative connotation, but that's exactly what it does is it's activating that part of your brain.
Right. So we're not talking about cocaine and methamphetamine.
Magic mushrooms or anything like that. Yeah, totally. No, caffeine, that's a good point. Yeah, caffeine is a psychoactive in the purest sense of the term.
Yes, and in the purest sense of the term, it's an addictive drug as well. So our brain does get addicted to coffee.
Yeah, dependency is the one thing that gets me about coffee, and I don't drink to the levels I've never had a caffeine headache, but I don't like dependency. I just don't like the thought of my body, kind of needing this substance to get along. But I also know it's a pretty light dependency, and there's no real harmful withdrawal side effects, right? So I think it's just kind of a trade-off that some people need to make.
I'm going to be really a smartass here for a minute, but some other dependencies that we have?
I know where you're going. Hit me.
Air.
Water.
Food. Loving relationships.
But we manage to incorporate those in our life nonetheless. We manage.
So, I'm not so sure that we should be looking at caffeine as with any negative.
Right. That's a fascinating take. But, I also understand if you're really concerned with, your body as a temple and this or that. And actually, you take a look at a lot of religious people don't drink coffee. Like, for instance, monks aren't allowed to drink coffee. They drink tea, which has caffeine. Interesting. The tea gets no bad stigma there. But you know what I'm saying. I think that there's
but that was a history. If you go back into the history of coffee, and we can have a whole podcast on the history of coffee.
Absolutely.
That was a whole stigma that happened. So let's save that for another podcast.
For sure. Yeah. And I know it happened in a couple different parts of the world, Asia and Europe. And yeah, that's great. Listen, I think we're going to have to make this a two-parter, Steve. This is some really great information, and I want to really dive deep into this. So why don't we call it for this episode, and we'll have you back on, and we'll talk about acidity and maybe a little more on dependency and all that stuff. Does that sound good?
That sounds wonderful. I'm always glad to be back with you, Jordan.
Yeah, man. ibleedcoffee.com is Steve's website. Check out everything he's got going on there. Coffee booklet, lots of stuff. Sign up for the mailing list. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. This is Dr. Coffee, Dr. Stephen Helschien, signing off with Jordan Rivers saying, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast.